Hello and welcome to the Sociology 3 Module 8 video lecture where we'll be talking about identifying value and descriptive assumptions. So first let's start by talking about what assumptions are. So they're things that the author believes to be true, and they're usually not stated outright or explicitly. So they're not usually going to be obvious, but they're incredibly important for understanding an author's argument. They're usually taken for granted ideas about how the world works, or at least how it should work. And what's really important from a critical thinking perspective is assumptions tend to support the explicit reasoning of the argument. So the explicit reasoning being the reasons that a communicator will offer for why we should accept his or her stance on an argument. And they're very important for connecting the conclusion to the reasons. Remember, the three basic components of an author's argument are the issue, the conclusion, and the reasons that the author offers for his conclusion. And you're going to hear me say this over and over again throughout the semester. So by the time you finish this class, you are not going to forget those key components of an argument. So assumptions, what they do is they're really, there's something that the author believes to be true that's really important for connecting the conclusions to the reasons. So we have to be really attuned to detecting what they are. So how can we do that? How can we identify assumptions? So the first step is to look for assumptions that are needed for the reasons to support the conclusion, right? Those two really important components of an argument, reasons, conclusions. What unstated ideas are connecting them? We always want to ask that question. Step number two, we should look for assumptions that are necessary for a particular reason to be true. So authors will offer us many reasons. Often they'll offer us many reasons for supporting a conclusion. And oftentimes those those reasons are based on particular assumptions of how the world works, or at least how it should work. So remember, just like we learned in last week's module about the importance of searching for ambiguity, right? Words or terms that can have multiple meanings. We also must train our minds to search for assumptions, because both ambiguous terms and phrases and assumptions, understanding what those are and being able to detect them and understand how they're related to the author's reasoning are incredibly important components of evaluating their arguments. So there are two major types of assumptions: value assumptions and descriptive assumptions. And I want to talk about each of those in turn next. First, value assumptions. These are taken for granted beliefs about the relative desirability of competing values. So put more simply, these are beliefs about how the world should be. Several key examples that Brown and Keeley offer us in Chapter 5, loyalty versus honesty. Should you tell your teacher that your best friend cheated on a test? Do you do the honest thing and tell her? Or do you stay loyal to your friend? So there's a value conflict right there. Competition versus cooperation. Do you share your notes with a classmate for a test that's going to be graded on a curve? Do you value competition and doing well over cooperation, sharing those notes with your classmate? The third one that I have listed here, the third example, individual responsibility versus community responsibility, is probably the most important, certainly most common value assumption that we as sociologists and social scientists must often contend with. So an example here is, would you support paying higher taxes to fund more social programs? Supporting paying higher taxes, as an individual responsibility, that's more responsibility put on the individual's shoulders, but social programs and the funding of social programs is a community responsibility. Which one do you value more? And so a lot of issues in sociology that we study as social scientists really come down to this tension between individual responsibility and community responsibility, especially for addressing various social problems like poverty, which is the subject of our second reading in this module. So in addition to value assumptions, we also have descriptive assumptions. So descriptive assumptions are beliefs about the way the world was, is, or will be. So value assumptions is about how the world should be. Descriptive assumptions, how the world actually is. So some common descriptive assumptions that Brown and Keeley offer us: the world is just, the world is fair. We like to believe that's true, don't we? Number two, because something happened in the past, it's likely to happen in the future. A lot of people make this particular assumption and will make arguments based on that particular reasoning. Number three, our lives unfold as a result of personal choices. Very interesting, right? So sociologists actually try to counter this descriptive assumption a lot and really try to, as we talked about a little bit earlier when we talked about Mills and the sociological imagination, sociologists really do try to emphasize how social circumstance affects how our lives unfold, but a lot of people do assume that our lives unfold as a result of personal choices. So what can we do to locate assumptions? There are several key questions that we can ask. Remember, critical thinking is all about training your mind to ask key questions. So what did the author have to assume for his or her reasons to support the conclusion? So here's an example. Fresno is a desirable place to live. That would be the author's conclusion in this case. Here we have a great zoo, large parks, and a variety of restaurants. So here the author has offered us 3 reasons for why we should accept the conclusion that Fresno is a desirable place to live. But what is the assumption here? Well, the unstated assumption is that people are going to deem a place as desirable to live based on having a great zoo, based on large parks, or based on having a variety of restaurants. Now, for some people, those criteria may be incredibly important for how they judge whether a place is desirable to live or not. For other people, other things might matter. The job market in a particular location or the quality of schools. So the point here is, notice that the author is really making a particular assumption about what matters for why people want to live in a particular place. Another question you can ask yourself is, do any unstated ideas support the author's reasons? So here's another example. All people should take a critical thinking class in college. Critical thinking classes are necessary to learn how to evaluate arguments. Are there any unstated ideas that are really necessary to make those reasons be true? Well, one, it assumes that the quality of the critical thinking classes that students would take would actually address evaluating arguments. Some critical thinking classes may not address that, and therefore that would undermine the author's reason in this particular case. Or maybe the classes don't teach students to do that well. So you can see here how there are a variety of reasons, a variety of assumptions that really are necessary to support the author's reasoning structure. Something else that you can also do is you can identify with the writer or the speaker. You can learn more about her or his background and affiliation. This is a really important clue to figuring out what particular value and descriptive assumptions they might bring to the table, and therefore what assumptions would infuse their kinds of reasoning. You could also identify with someone who opposes the conclusion and the reasons. So going back to our first example, think about maybe someone who thinks that Fresno is not a desirable place to live. I know there are people out there like that. Can you believe it? I actually think this is a wonderful place to live. However, by taking the stance of someone who opposes the conclusion, you might say, okay, well, why do you think Fresno is not a desirable place to live? And someone might answer, well, there aren't many jobs available here. And so that might clue you in to the fact that offering the reasons that we have a great zoo, we have large parks and a variety of restaurants, that there are particular assumptions there about what makes a place desirable to live in. So now I want to transition to talking about the rank reading. I love this title, As American as Apple Pie, Poverty and Welfare. And what I want to do is I want to apply what we've learned about assumptions to the rank reading and to see if we can identify if he's making any value or descriptive assumptions. So like we always want to do with every reading, what is the issue? We want to identify that. What is Rank's conclusion? What are his reasons? And thinking back to last week's module, does he use any ambiguous terms or phrases? Hopefully, you asked yourself, so Rank is talking a lot about poverty, but what does poverty necessarily mean? Poverty in this particular context can be quite ambiguous. There are a lot of different definitions for poverty, a lot of different ways that social scientists define poverty. Poverty can be defined in an absolute sense, which means people don't have access to the things that they need to just meet their very basic needs for water and food and clothing and shelter. Or poverty can be defined in a relative sense. What are the living standards of the majority of people in a particular society like the U.S.? Poverty in the U.S. tends to mean very different things than it does, say, in other parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what's interesting is rank actually does give you some contextual clues, right? We always want to look at context clues to help you understand what particular meaning or definition of poverty that he's using in this article. And in this case, he's using a government definition of poverty. So the government definition of poverty, often called the poverty line or poverty threshold, is determined based on one's overall total household income, all the income that people in that household are bringing in, and the size of the family. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, it's actually a really interesting topic. You can go to the website of the Department of Health and Human Services and actually see if a household would be considered living in poverty based on how much money they're bringing in and how many people are living in that house. So for a family of 3, the poverty level right now is just a little over $18,000, meaning that if you're in a household of 3 people, if you make just over $18,000, you are considered to be living in poverty. So let's identify those other important aspects of his reasoning structure. So what is the issue? So hopefully you were able to identify that the issue here is the commonality of poverty in the United States, how common poverty is. Rank's conclusion is that poverty is a normal part of the life cycle in the United States. And in fact, most Americans will experience poverty for at least a year of their lives and will need to rely on social services. So what are the reasons that he offers for why we should support this conclusion? There are several, but I'm just going to highlight 3. He says most Americans will experience financial emergencies throughout their lifetimes, including things such as job loss and family breakup. He also offers as a reason that there is little government help to tide families over during financial emergencies. And finally, he says that the American labor market often fails to provide enough jobs for Americans to fully support their families. So next we want to ask, did Rank make any value or descriptive assumptions? What assumptions connect his conclusion to his reasons? What about his background? He's a sociologist, so is there anything about being a sociologist? I think you guys are probably starting to pick up on this already at this point in the class. Any aspects of his background that might predict that he's going to come to this topic and talk about this topic based on having a particular set of value or descriptive assumptions? And then finally, how might someone who opposes Rank's interpretation of poverty think about the issue differently? So these are some key questions that we can ask to help us identify Rank's assumptions in this particular reading. So here are several that I identified. This list is not exhaustive, meaning that there are certainly others. But first of all, he assumes that job loss and divorce do often lead to poverty, and this is a descriptive assumption, right? It's factual. It's about how the world does work. There's a lot of evidence in the sociological literature that does find that this is in fact a true assumption, but it is unstated in his article. Divorce is actually one of the most common reasons that women and children especially are thrust into poverty. He also assumes that government programs, such as what we often call welfare, would be effective in keeping families out of poverty. This is also a descriptive assumption. Now, what's interesting is there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of welfare benefits in a lot of states, because welfare is often cash aid programs, which is what we often refer to as welfare, is usually distributed via state governments. Oftentimes the cash assistance that the welfare recipients get is actually not enough to keep their family above the poverty line. Another assumption that he makes is if Americans were working, they would likely not experience poverty. Again, another descriptive assumption, how the world works. And in fact, there are actually a lot of Americans in this country who are working full-time who are still living below the poverty line based on their family size. If you have a few minutes, do the math. It's really interesting. If you calculate the minimum wage, if you take the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, it's a little bit higher here in California, you multiply that by 40 hours a week, full-time, 52 weeks a year. Let's assume this person doesn't even get any vacation. that's actually not enough to pull a family of 2 above the poverty line. So a lot of work